Okay, let me start the next session. And again, I think it was a very interesting and very useful session this morning. Apologies if you didn't get a chance to ask your question in the audience or have your question answered online. But we will be sharing a lot of the information from today. And we hope this is just a stepping stone to go forwards. We're now moving into our panel discussion. And it gives me pleasure to first introduce Anya Sitaram, who's on the far end, she'll introduce the panel members. But Anya is an award-winning journalist. She's been a broadcaster. She specializes on the science side. She's also, more recently, running her own TV production company. And she's made a number of recent programs, a series on global health for the BBC, and also a program called Hot Cities, which I got excited about. Is this the cities you need to go to, which are hot, but it's actually the cities, how they cope with being hot. So it's how to adapt to climate change. She's also recently moved to Somerset, where we've had the floods. I think she was on a hill, so she watched the floods. But again, she's seeing what happens in this country as well in other countries. So she's going to moderate our panel. And the exam question is, what are the game changers in securing food security under climate change? So, Anya, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming back after tea. You may remember that before the tea break, we had a question to all of you, and that was, what is the best idea right now? Who has the best idea now for building resilience in smallholder agriculture? Was it the public sector, private sector, or farmers? And you pretty much all agreed that it was the farmers. Well, Vanessa, what did the online audience have to say?
32% said the public sector, 8% said the private sector, and 60% said the farmers. Okay, so a little bit more faith in the public sector.
Right, a bit more faith in the public sector, but unlike the first question, left divergence, everyone's agreed that it's the farmers. This morning we had some very interesting speeches about the plight of smallholder farmers. And in this debate, we're going to look at game-changing options, but we're also going to focus particularly on the role that the private sector has to play. So let me introduce the panel to you. We have Rowan Douglas, who's chairman of the Willis Research Network and leader of the Capital Science and Policy Practice at Willis. Next to him, we have Christof Walter, who is an independent consultant who also works in sustainability issues. We have Ruth Davis, who's political director of Greenpeace UK. And we have Gerry Boyle, who's head of advocacy at Care International UK. Thank you very much for coming and joining the panel. I'd like to start with Rowan at the other end there. I can barely see you, but there you are. Just a very quick question, your reaction to the poll. It's not surprising that everyone thought that farmers are the best people to adapt and come up with solutions.
No, I think interesting, there was a big debate in Britain last night. I was on the TV, and I was intrigued to see how the audience reaction was sort of corresponding to the reaction out there to the audience we're really speaking to, I guess. I'm going to make a confession. I didn't put my hand up at all when David asked, is it a public-private sector, where are the brains that are going to solve this? Because you probably picked up in my title of my job, Capital Science and Policy, there is no one solution set. We've gone far beyond that. Some of you might have read Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions and sort of paradigm shifts. We're kind of there, and the solution is going to come ultimately through a convergence between these communities. So I want to pick up on just a couple of points, and then I'll address specifically the issue about the role of farmers. The first is that I think it was Michelle said the greatest risk is fragmentation of efforts. I'm really excited by the range of folks who have been brought here today. And actually, this is quite a special time, a special moment. We will only develop solutions if we get out of our comfort zones and silos. And ultimately, that's about different communities truly trusting each other. So I was sitting down there and was able to hear in the background, stuff, and people made the odd comment about, well, we're here in the city and all the rest of it. And you may be surprised that above this room sit essentially hundreds of hydrologists and geographers and other people who are actually passionate about saving millions of lives and billions of dollars of property and livelihoods in the decades through the institution and the mechanism of insurance, which has been a fundamental means of allowing society to understand risk, develop parameters of shared behavior through public, private, and mutual mechanisms. Some of the acts of parliament of this country, which I am most proud of, have the word insurance in them, and we are all dependent upon them. But it was only because people in business were prepared to lead above the needs of the next quarter. The people in the public sector saw business as a fundamental essence of who we are, and people in science, and the Royal Society was co-founded in this square mile, who saw their role was to provide impact and help society navigate its journey. So that, I would say, is the critical point of today, and I pay tribute to those who have brought this group together. To the point about the role of the farmers, of course, it's the right thing to say. But whether we're farmers or whatever other role we play, frankly, we all operate in a system. And those farmers, actually, we were talking about the challenges of British agriculture at a meeting last week. Whether you're a British farmer or an Ethiopian farmer, you operate in a system. And we have to change the rules of the game. You said, what are the game changes? We have to change the rules of the game. The final point I'll make, I've gone a bit, this is my sort of introductory bit, then I'll be short after this, is 9 years ago, I read a groundbreaking book by an author called Ana González Pelayo. And the book was Human Rights in World Trade, Hunger in International Society. And what she basically said was, why are the economic rights, which are essentially enshrined from 1947 onwards, not delivered? And actually, she looked at the challenge of hunger as mediated through the World Trade System. And I've kept in touch with her, and over the last 9 years, I've begun to understand through her the critical role that the financial regulatory system has in delivering human rights, and insurance as an institution of society, of organizing society, public, as is market and sovereignty and diplomacy. Ironically, the focal point for this transition is going to be the role of helping save lives and livelihoods and property against disaster risk through Hyogo framework and food security. And I cannot say the importance of the timing of this meeting, this audience, and it is no accident that we're having it here. Because if we can change the rules of the game of finance and financial regulation, which is centralized in Basel, it will affect the Ethiopian farmer as much as the funding for public sector works in India, or even us going shopping in Tesco's.
Just one question then. So should insurance for everyone, even for the smallest of the farmers, be compulsory?
I'm not saying it should be compulsory, although in many places it kind of is. Health insurance in this country is compulsory. We all pay our taxes. But what I would say is this. There are two buzzwords at the moment through which you can do anything. Under the phrase financial stability, you can almost get sort of anything sort of driven through, but also financial inclusion. Unless people are included in the financial system, I regretfully say, literally, they don't count. They are literally not accounted for. And I do passionately believe that if we can include people in the financial system, public, private, or mutual, when things happen, they do count. I would love to see that through the combination of public-private, this is an aspiration, this isn't a policy. Why is it not that we could actually say that every child born in wherever, whatever region we want to say, should have $1,000 worth of health insurance for the first 1,000 days of their life through a shared mechanism globally. And you know what? As soon as that happened, and they'd then have to have their vaccinations, they'd have to have all the things they need. And you know what? If we made that happen, all of them would exist. They'd all be accounted for here throughout their lives in the right way. So I passionately believe in the financial system to deliver security as a platform for sustainable growth.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Let me just remind the audience watching online that the hashtag is IPPCAG, and that's anyone wants to tweet here, that's also the hashtag. Let me bring in Gerry now. Gerry, we heard there about the need for financial institutions to be involved and to be embraced much further. Let's look at the private sector in the role of smallholders. How do you persuade the private sector to put finance into the smallest of the smallholders?
Well, can I just pick up the point about financial inclusion, which is where a great deal of CARE's work has historically been, and which we see as being absolutely crucial in empowering poor people and including that getting investment to smallholder farmers, which is key to food security. But one point is that from our perspective, resilience is immediately improved by savings. So we work very hard at bringing poor people together in villages, in village savings associations, which immediately allows people to deal with temporary hiccups in their life or even quite substantial setbacks, which can either be weather or personal or whatever. And in fact, within the context of climate change, in Sub-Saharan Africa, our adaptation learning program has made quite extensive use of these savings groups to allow people to support people to diversify their livelihood strategies, to start on new crops, new livestock, and new livelihoods. And within that, we recognize that a savings and loan organization within a village gives people a safe environment in which to save, in which to gain access to credit, and also provide some level of welfare payments, if necessary, to reduce risk to individuals. However, we also recognize that the formal banking sector, which generally would be the private sector, although in many countries it's microfinance institutions, but also the clearing banks, the traditional retail banks, are an important step up for those groups as they actually develop their savings and need greater security, and also for some of the members of those groups need greater access to credit so that they can actually move further up the enterprise ladder. Now, the problem within savings is that actually there's a need for a very high level of investment in financial literacy for people to understand the products, to use them effectively, and to save effectively. And then the beginnings of business training so that as people start micro-enterprises, they can make them successful. And whilst we actually have a process in a number of countries where we're linking private sector banks to these savings groups, one of our challenges is actually trying to persuade the private sector to invest early in that financial literacy so that we can actually build those bridges. Now, to some extent, that is about the fact that some of these people will eventually become good, successful customers for banks, but also it is about what kind of environment the private sector wants to work in within particular countries and what level of stability, what level of economic development do they want to work in. So there is a business case of sorts for businesses, but there's still a major bridge to be built between the real needs of poor people living in remote villages and the formal banking sector. And aggregating people living in poverty is one clear route to doing that and is a role that is quite often played by NGOs. However, I just want to really repeat the point that was made a lot earlier on, which is that sort of somehow or another trying to make people living in poverty attractive as an investment option for the private sector without substantial state intervention and without substantial co-investment is really not very feasible. And also that frequently the answer for the more than 800 million people who are already living in food security before they're further impacted by climate change, only a relatively small number of those will certainly ever be engaged in global value chains. That's a very long way off. And actually that what's needed much more immediately is a lot more investment in agriculture locally and in providing improved access to local markets, in which the people what we might automatically think of as the private sector, the large companies, even large national companies, have very little role to play, but in fact the private sector, in the sense that everybody, the smallest farmer who has to run their farm as a business, is very much a member of the private sector.
So what you're really saying, Gerry, and you actually have a long history as a management consultant in the private sector, but what you see as a solution is public-private partnerships.
Well,
No? Have I put words in your mouth?
Well, no, I think both the public sector and the private sector have a role to play. However, the phrase public-private partnerships is so laden with a particular model of investment that I really would be very careful about trying to use that term. I think many people in the private sector and many people in the public sector who support an export-led, jobs-oriented model of growth position public-private partnerships as being a substantial solution. The problem is that they're rarely sufficiently transparent enough or hold companies or indeed governments sufficiently to account to the people that they're ultimately intended to benefit, that within civil society there's quite a reasonable degree of suspicion about how they're working and what impacts they're actually going to have. So I'm very wary of the phrase, but I do agree with the speakers earlier on today that what we need is systemic change, and that there are many, many participants within that. Thank
you. Let's turn now to Ruth. Have you heard any solutions there? Do you think there's a bigger role for the private sector in smallholder agriculture around the world?
I'm going to zoom out a little bit and answer that partly from the perspective of solutions to the wider problem of climate change, because we're having this conversation in the context of the publication of the IPCC report. We're also having it in a context where we know that we're moving towards a serious global negotiation about a deal to try to deal with emissions. And we know very much from the scientific briefing we had earlier on that there are going to be limits to adaptation, that what we can do at the local level is vital and vitally important in terms of building resilience and adaptation. But we have, at the same time, to be able to address the substantial political barriers to achieving an outcome, both in terms of a global agreement and in terms of emissions reductions. Do I see hopeful signs around that? Yes, I do. I'm an endless optimist, which you have to be if you work in climate policy. I partly see a really optimistic sign in the sense that many of the people in the development community here are people whom I work with on a day-to-day basis, who I consider to be my close personal friends and colleagues, and we've been through some bumpy rides together over the course of the last sort of maybe 5 years, where there was a perception in the past that perhaps environmental objectives and environmental goals were different or in conflict to development goals. I don't feel that perception anymore in the community that I work in. I think we fundamentally feel that we're engaged in the same struggle, and that environmental sustainability underpins the possibility of development, and that without tackling the problems of development and inequality, we have no prospect of getting anywhere. So for the rest of the world, look out, here we are actually. This is a fairly solid civil society partnership around development and environment. That makes me happy. Makes me happy that the cost of solar panels reduced by about 80% in the course of about 5 years. Technological change is out there if we know how to grasp it. So I don't think we should see this as a technical problem. I think we have a much better and more porous understanding of the relationship between the private sector, public sector, and civil society than we've had previously. I just couldn't agree with you more about remembering that actually the private sector is everybody out there in the real economy. It's not a single blanket term. You can't encompass somebody working in a small business in, kind of the outskirts of Mumbai in the same umbrella that you talk about Unilever or Exxon. It's like highly diverse. This is just the economy. And we have many allies and many ways of sort of dealing with that. I think we've become much better at understanding bottom-up demand-led solutions to problems. So actually, the UN system is becoming much more sensitive to the idea that if you're going to channel finance into agriculture, for example, the way in which you should be doing that is to look for the demand in the countries that are going to receive that finance and mold your finance in the way that you deliver that, whether it's public or private sector or a blend of both, to seek the needs of the people on the ground. We're all much cannier about that. We're much more three-dimensional than we used to be. But, and there is a big but, this is a great group of people and it's really nice to see everybody, but really, guys, there is a massive political gap between where we need to be to deal with these problems, both on the ground in terms of agricultural resilience and in terms of addressing the emissions problem. At this stage, maybe a year and a half out from two really critical negotiations about our development pathway and about climate change, it is still almost impossible to engage the leaders, both on the developing countryside and the developed countryside, to address the risks that they face if they don't deal with the problem of climate change. And we have to own that problem in this room right now. I actually think, ironically, the leadership engagement is better at the level of the Chinese government and the US than it is at the level of European governments, though traditionally the Europeans have led. Every single one of you has got some means or route to address that problem. I think we're going to hear from Minister in DFID later. My immediate challenge to her is, does she get up every day and demand that on the Prime Minister's desk is a memo about the substantial and systemic risk to the British economy to actually development globally from climate change? If she doesn't, then we're going to fail in that negotiation, because what will happen is that when we hit political barriers, there will be no big red telephone. We cannot call Cameron, we cannot call Merkel, and that negotiation will fail if we don't have leadership engagement. So there's a job for every person in this room to try to deal with that. I also actually think there's a real moral hazard question in relation to the overwhelming power of the private sector, which maybe is going to answer your second point. What should the private sector be doing in this context? As I say, it's not one entity or one thing, but here's a philosophical point almost, or at least a kind of point about the political world we live in. I think it's unarguable that actually power has migrated into the hands of global business. It is extraordinarily difficult for national governments to make regulatory choices that are genuinely going to affect that power and that are not going to impact on their competitiveness. Now that creates a moral hazard for all of you in the private sector, because you are now in the driving seat. So that means that you actually have a moral role. You cannot hide from that. Listen to Paul Toulmin, who says, we no longer have a license to operate in a world in which we behave like an amoeba and where we just wait for government to prod us with a stick before we do something. It's not good enough anymore. And I went in last week to talk to Oliver Letwin about climate change. One of the things he said to me was, we don't hear from the private sector other than those lobbying against action on climate change and those who want money for wind farms. So where is the private sector in representing the case about systemic risk to its business model to the leaders of our governments who have to go out there and sign a deal? And until the private sector does that, it is not playing a constructive or interesting role.
Ruth, thank you. Well, Christof, you were with Unilever as a sustainable sourcing manager, and now you run your own consultancy company. Let me just put that point to you. More private sector involvement, more moral hazard.
Okay. And I think there's probably a distinction between the general climate change discussion here and then very specific issues, specific supply chains, specific commodities that are of interest. And I think we have to remind ourselves of the role of business and the interest and the drivers of business. And I think very often at the moment there's a fashion to see business almost as the better development agents, I would say, and the better policy agents, if you like.
I think Ruth would disagree with you there, but anyway.
I disagree as well, because I think if we go back and say, well, actually, what are the drivers? Businesses are there to make money, and that's their agenda. Yeah, so they're not agents of policy, they're not agents of development. However, I think there can be very effective instruments of development, of change, of the changes that we would like to see, where these agendas coincide well enough. And I think that the big fundamental question is we don't really understand very well how to play and how to use these instruments. Companies don't understand internally very well often how they impact development, how they impact smallholder farmers, what's happening on the ground. Gerry and I have a bit of a history in trying to figure this out while Gerry was in Oxfam and I was in Unilever on a project together, which is now actually coming to conclusion. What is the impact of companies, of branded goods companies who often have got very little visibility of their supply chains on the ground, and can the way they do business actually make a difference? And I think that's the really interesting thing to understand here, is not so much the what, it's the how, the graduations. How do you, we talked about perverse incentives, how do you send the right signals through the supply chain from, say, a branded goods company or a retailer down to where actually farmers are? And how do you make sure that your buying policies and your quality requirements and other specifications around the product actually do not make things worse, and where they have the power to actually make things better? And I think if we could start with understanding that a lot better, and there's companies like The Body Shop, I think, have got a long history in doing that because they're on the ground. But most of the big consumer goods companies, most of the retailers haven't got the visibility throughout the majority of the supply chains to what's happening on the ground. So they work with other companies, and they work through sometimes very, very complex supply chains to eventually touching a farmer. And the farmer often wouldn't know that they actually produce a product for one of these companies. A Body Shop farmer would actually know that they produce for the Body Shop. Many cocoa farmers, many coffee farmers, many maize, rice, starch products, highly processed things, they haven't got an idea. And there's no visibility in either direction. So I think if we can understand the how does the procurement, how does the way that the companies interact with the farming base, if we understand that better, we can start making a difference. And I think the other interesting point is that although companies are, as organizations, are not development agents, and I think we should not forget that they are there to maximize the investment that's been put in them, people within these companies often are very motivated by the ability to achieve development outcomes and to achieve environmental outcomes. And I think we can see quite strong differentiation, actually, on the job market and in the HR sector, in those companies who give people space to follow these aspirations and follow their own ideas and their own agendas within a company setting to make things better, vis-a-vis those that uphold very strong only economic principles. And I think that's another degree of freedom we have, and we need to understand a lot better. I think how can we harness and how can we use incentives that people feel individually within a company to actually make a positive impact through how the company operates? How can we actually translate that into more predictable, more reliable, sort of more streamlined success in actually making these things happen on the ground? I don't know whether that answers your question and what we should see at the global level.
To some extent. I just want to just get it back down to the smallholder on the ground. Here's the thing, just before we go on to get your big game changer from each one of you, just out of interest, Gerry, if you were to, well, because you deal with the smallholders on the ground, perhaps you have more experience of it. So you help them. They get better seeds, better technology. They're using smart agriculture. Their livelihoods improve. They are rich enough to send their kids to school. They become more educated. Then what happens to the next generation? Do they stop being farmers? Do they move on? Okay, who's going to feed everyone in the world?
So I think there are a couple of points in there. One is we don't really spend our time handing out tools and seeds to people, but rather working with them to try and make sure that they're better able to define their own futures and to achieve that by developing their capabilities, etc. But you do raise a very important point, which is this point which was raised again earlier on this morning by the representative from IFAD, that agriculture in many countries is seen as a very poor career option. And we see that in the sort of aging profile of cocoa farmers. We see that in across lots of different crops and lots of different types of farming, where youth are not engaged, don't have an immediate livelihood option by engaging in farming, because the roles are sort of held by middle-aged farmers. And that really is a major challenge to national governments. It is a major challenge to the private sector as well, about how to retain bright, well-motivated, educated youth within farming, and they can be a true key to much more successful farming, given a higher level of skill in education. And that's one that's certainly on the agenda, but I don't think many people yet have very clear solutions to it.
Thank you. Let's hear from one of you. Warren, you've already outlined a game-changing option. Give me a minute of something that's really going to change everything and not only help feed 9 billion people in the year 2030, but also be able to cope with all the volatile climate changes that we see coming.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up Ruth's phrase. She talked a lot about risk. She talked about the private sector. And it is all about risk. And we need to incorporate risk properly into the system. One of the ironic things is, I'm coming out of the closet. I'm a geographer. My passion is that geography will become more influential than economics in about 10 or 15 years. We're forming a new club called Geographers with Edge. All right? And you find them in all sorts of places. They don't call them so, in the Treasury and all sorts of places, but we're coming out of the closet. So if anyone wants to join it, come and see me afterwards. But one of the ironic things is, if you want to properly express the value of the ecosystem or of the agricultural sector, if you want to properly express its value, the way you do that is to actually evaluate the risks of its diminution or its to the existing economic system. So you use risk to ironically impute the value of the oceans or whatever. And this is a bit of a game changer. So I'm going to, sorry, this is a bit of a different way of looking through the telescope. But I implore you to just go afterwards and sort of don't forget that and just let it model. I'll tell you why. What we need is two things. We need a time machine and we need a mass spectrometer. So I spend my time having to be concerned about climate risk because about 50% of the capital charge of the global insurance sector is driven by the exposure to Mother Nature. It's massive. Thousands of billions, actually. And we faced in this square mile, as a metaphor, an existential crisis 25 years ago. You'll remember, if you're in Britain, Lloyd's names. The English aristocracy was changed not so much by socialism, but by Lloyd's of London, in a sense. I mean, it was a mass transfer of wealth. And the challenge is that these climate change issues, they're out there, yeah, 2040, 2050. It's a long term, not in my term of office, not in all the rest of it. And also, they're kind of nebulous issues. How does it all fit together? And what happened after our existential crisis 25 years ago with three things. One, a scientific revolution. From the parochial, we adopted the spreadsheet. Pervasive and hugely powerful, but I mean, it changed everything. But also, advanced modeling, climate modeling. We fund 50 universities. So a scientific revolution, coupled with new smart capital saying, we'll put our capital to bear, but you've got to be kind of in the new romantic period. Take account of nature. It does exist. Adam Smith 2.0. And the third one was a regulatory transformation. People said, this insurance contract, what is it? It's a promise to pay, whether it's public, private, or mutual, if things go wrong. And for 300 years or so, it's worked, but it doesn't work anymore. I mean, places were going bust all over the world. They said, what should the tolerance of an insurance contract be? Should it be 1 in 10,000 years, like a nuclear power station? Sounds a bit high. 1 in 100 years, like a bridge? Sounds a bit low. And in a kind of a porridge moment that took about a decade, about 1 in 200, 1 in 250-year tolerance for an insurance contract. So insurance companies now have to be capitalized to withstand that risk over a 12-month period, and 50% of that, for most non-life insurance companies, is driven by Mother Nature. And what happened was this 1 in 200-year focus on extremes. So we have to model the risk for global insurers as well as little mutuals in a county in England. We have to understand what is the maximum probable loss of extreme events from anthro nature in a 12-month period. You know, we have the worst combination of the most horrible typhoons and hurricanes and earthquakes and all the rest of it. And what that does is it acts like a time machine. And it takes all those nebulous issues and it translates it into here and now. And then companies have to be capitalized for that. It's a mass spectrometer. So actually, the most effective, focusing on ag and food systems, not ag, food systems, is I'm quite passionate about saying there is already a risk at 1 in 200-year return period tolerance to the global financial system of a food security crisis, a multi-bread basket failure caused by climate, a crop pandemic, volcanoes, and all the economic and political impacts that would propagate. We have to evaluate that. And we need to do that as part of, I think, the fiduciary responsibility, but there's lots of risks to look at the moment. But once we do that, and if it is material, it will get integrated into the financial system under the existing rules that exist. And ironically, you've suddenly made this count. And as fortunately, we all obey the laws of physics. As the fundamentals change, both environmentally and demographic and all the rest of it, those 1 in 200-year risks will inevitably go up year after year after year. And to your point, Ruth, about there's resilience issues that drives. You can buy some insurance, you can build a seawall, you can do some more fertilizer. But we will see over quite a short period of time that at that level of extreme, the overall risk in the system, probably by 2030, 2040, 2050, will get so significant that actually tactical, what I would call, if you like, adaptation resilience, may not be sufficient. And in our increasingly good crystal balls of the modeled world, we will be able to do that, almost that projection in a few years' time of what these stress tests will be like in 2030. And the only way you can then deal with the risk, which is now going to be accounted for, is to reduce the overall level of risk in the system. So 2 things. One, that means reducing the amount probably of carbon in the atmosphere. But the other thing is, and I'm passionate about, and my thanks to ISU, International, Justin said some nice words in the beginning. They have taught me about the 2015 sort of world, all these processes, which you all know about, but I don't. Well, I do a bit more now. And I am passionate that if we get to January 2016 and we haven't basically sorted out some of the basic financial rules of the game, and I think the insurance world does have some techniques it's had to adopt, which may be a model for. If we get to January 2016 and we haven't worked this out, and ag is a key part of it, I simply cannot see how we're going to have a multilateral solution going forward. It would seem to me that a very rational response for governments, companies, cities is to say, we'll talk the game, but we have to be resilient in ourselves. And again, the overall capacity of the system will be reduced. So I would be very keen to see how we can rapidly inject these approaches, which do seem to work. Now we have massive disaster years, and the financial system in insurance is at a macro level resilient. It's amazing, because we've taken account of nature. Let's use that, but now use it in the broader world where it could make a big impact. So that's my game changer, sorry.
Thank you, Rowan. I do want to take questions in about the next 3 minutes. So the rest of you, if you could tell me very briefly.
Oh, so sorry. Christof. Host privilege.
Game-changing technology or finance, or both?
This is without talking faster, I think. Financial, my game changer. And I think if we would find financial products, better financial products that would link what I would call big money, big finance, pension funds, with the ability to actually invest in farming and the benefits that farming and better land management generates not only for the farm but at a broader level, and if we do that at a landscape scale, I think that's the silver bullet. and do allow me to give an example. There is a fantastic film by John Liu, Hope in Changing Climate. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do. It's online, which talks about mainly the lost plateau in China and how the government there starts to do basically what they call a large-scale ecosystem restoration in a lost plateau. It's the size of France, so it's a landscape, a big landscape. And they've started, I think, on areas now the size of Belgium that they have restored. What that does is it generates carbon benefits, so it's carbon sequestration, biodiversity benefits, massively improved livelihoods. It increases tax takings by the government, so this actually starts paying for itself. And water, microclimate, regional climate, all affected in a very positive way, very doable, quick timescales, 5 years, you see benefits before that. And there are some other examples around the world where similar things have happened. So if we can get actually big finance to invest in these things, I think we have a fantastic game changer. And the trick will be to not only be able to channel that money into it, but also to channel the upside, the benefits from that back to the investors, because that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for heart of gold investments and loans. They're actually looking for an investment where they participate in the risks and the benefits alike. And I think if we can find instruments that do that at a landscape level, probably channeled through governments in some form or shape, I think we have a game changer.
Ruth, a game changer, not necessarily policy. Can you think of a financial or a technological solution?
There are lots of technological solutions out there. I'm going to say that the game changer is the private sector using its power to bring those into reality. So how about every company that's concerned about the risks of climate change signs up to a pledge to source its energy from 100% renewable energy by a reasonable date, 2030. The collective buying power of the private sector can transform the energy economy of this world. Look at Google. You know, it's a transformational move, but it actually means taking responsibility and saying, we've got the power, we're going to use the power to make change in the real world. So that would be one. My second thing is I completely agree with you about risk. Again, the private sector has the power on risk. Describe the risk to your business. Describe the systemic risk to your business, and then go in and demand that instead of having a risk assessment process on climate change, which is held, forgive me, deaf for people, by the least powerful department in the whole of government in this country, under a climate change secretary who doesn't believe in climate change, who has just slashed the entire programme, go in, represent the risk to your business of climate change, and demand that the risk programme is located in a combination of number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and specifically addresses the question of financial rules in the way that you've talked about. But you guys have the power. You took it from national governments. They don't have the power and sovereignty. You own it in global corporate bodies. You have to use it responsibly.
Okay, Gerry.
Okay, I do think the biggest game changer will be political will, but to take something that's a little bit narrower, but still very important, I think it's gender. And I don't mean by that I'm trying to make the world's poor, marginalised women farmers take on all the responsibility for solving the problems of food insecurity and climate change, but rather that any investment in food security or climate change needs to be as effective as possible. And there are very high degrees of gendered labour division in agriculture. That they mean that often services, investment, are really blind and unresponsive to the different roles played by women and men, and therefore women very frequently lose out. And work by the FAO, etc., has already highlighted how even just bringing women up to the current levels of access to inputs that men have would actually take 100 to 150 million people out of hunger. But our programmatic work and working with some pretty big private sector companies shows that the role of gender within value chains and what can be done about it is not very well understood. And to mention Oxfam's name again, I looked at their Behind the Brands campaign, where they're looking at 10 of the world's leading food and beverage processors. And for 6 of those companies, their gender policies were the lowest ranked policy out of the 10 or so that Oxfam looked at. And I think that shows the level of the very low level at which companies currently are able to look at gender. So what needs to be done? It's about realization of women's rights to productive assets and resources. That's around land and inheritance, collective grazing rights, etc., and inequalities in access to services. So really around climate change, climate information services, the channeling out adaptation finance, and on a much broader scale, the types of financial inclusion I've already mentioned, but also access to markets, extension services, etc. Really delivering on women's rights and giving them the same access to services as men, and much better access to services than they have today, can really impact on food insecurity today and can make communities much, much more resilient to climate change in the future.
Thank you, Gerry. Time now for some questions from the audience here. Quite a few hands going up, and also just to remind the online audience that you can ask via Twitter using the hashtag IPCCAG or via the Q&A box that appears on your webcast screen. So hands up again. I'm going to take 3 right, and 1 at the back, and then 2 ladies in the middle there. So yes, please give me your name and ask a question briefly. Thank you.
My name is Kit Vaughan and I work for Care International. Just as I walked here this morning, I had the great pleasure of seeing a huge amount of grey elephants out in the square mile. And I like to call those grey elephants political economy grey elephants. And the same elephants have actually followed us into the room today. And I also think this is a fantastic discussion. I think we really need to have a bit more honesty about the political economy issues that drive climate change and affect smallholder farmers. So let's be honest. What causes and what degrades the natural environment, and what causes and drives climate change, overconsumption, unsustainable practices? Who, on the whole, has control and power and support for the majority of those emissions? The global north, the private sector, and national governments that have consistently failed to take account for those emissions. And so it disturbs me a little bit to hear the sort of the focus on, can we get smallholder farmers to mitigate? Well, I would say they've got food security concerns, which are critical. The second thing is, in terms of driving inequality, what drives inequality? It's an unregulated, unsustainable global economic system which is degrading our natural environment and driving inequality. So the question for the panel is, how do we get real on political economy? How do we actually get to the point whereby we say, do we need a game changer in the way that we drive our economic system?
Thank you. 2 ladies in the middle, yes?
Yeah, Marta Rivera from Spain, and also lead author of Chapter 9 on rural areas of the IPCC. I want to reflect on the role of institutions and the role of research also in the game changes. No? And I think when we are talking here about changing paradigms, this is not an easy task. Changing paradigms have different steps. One is changing practices. The second level will be changing structures. We are not yet there. We need to change governance system there. And we need to change worldviews. And I think, and it's also raised by the IPCC report, that the local government have a very important task here in building trust and participation, equal participation of different actors in order to build a common perspective and pragmatic perspective in order to change the worldview. But also research community has a lot to play when we try to monitorize, when we try to systematize success experiences that can lead to worldviews, which is the final step of, as I said, changing paradigms and transformation. So I think I would like to reflect on these other 2 actors in here.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bernadette Fischler from CAFOD. I would like to follow on from what Ruth said about that there is a political gap. And I would like to suggest that there is also a huge power gap that exists. Because you started with the question, who has the best solutions, the farmers, the private sector, the public sector, and decided that it would be the farmers. Now the farmers are the ones with the least power in this system, though. So how likely is it that the element with the least, or the actors with the least power in this system are going to drive and lead on these solutions? And what concrete things could you do to make this power relation more balanced? Because that would be probably also including giving up some of that power and making sure that others can lead and drive.
Thank you very much. Who would like to answer the first question, the game changers in the political economy? Rowan, would you like to have a go at that?
It's interesting you say those words, political economy, because those phrases would have been completely unheard of in this part of the world until quite recently. But they're beginning to get sort of, it's not quite as buzzword as some other things, but it's getting there. And I'm going to, if you like, refer you to my previous answer. The only way of changing those rules of the game economy is to properly account, in the broader sense, financially and then ultimately politically, for risk. And as soon as you do that, people will realize there are costs which have to be paid now for risks that may express themselves in the future, and that will begin to change the rules of the game. But I suppose to the sort of the point that somehow there's sort of this sort of, I'm not saying you have the view, it's sort of a Marxist view that it's all kind of, it's not, it's us. The drivers of consumption are us. We're all part of the private sector, unless we're in North Korea. We're all private citizens who want things. I know lots of Marxist academics who get big pay rises and who like selling their house for more than they bought it for. I know some of them personally, and so do you. So it's just us. It's quite grim to think of human beings as units of pollution, but that's basically what we are. So let's not pretend it's some kind of out there. The drivers of business, frankly, the drivers of government are, you have to be custodians and marshals of capital. That's it. That's the driver. The capital, and then it's the rules of the, it's basically, you have to manage and build wealth. That's what we all want to do. We have to have new definitions of what wealth is. And I know that even this government was thinking about that in its first part of its administration. It's had to sort of come off the pedal for that. But maybe we will start thinking about what does national wealth and individual wealth and well-being really mean. I know personally it isn't just about how much money is in the bank. So we've got to change that individual process, particularly in the north, as you described us. That's the first thing. But ultimately in business, wealth is generally managed by how much capital you have access to, and the score is kept by the accounting system. And then ultimately the value of companies, the value of, frankly, countries. And countries have to make money, as we've just seen. Ultimately, it's about changing the rule, and ultimately that then drives sentiment, and people buy stocks or invest in the Philippines or don't. So we're working in the Philippines at the moment to see, everyone knows they're ultra exposed to natural disaster risk now, and they're going to be challenged for getting all sorts of investment. We have to help them show the world that they are going to focus on resilience, which probably means taking some bitter pills of medicine now, because they know that otherwise they simply won't be able to attract the wealth. So I do understand I think I understand the question well, but I'm slightly concerned about the style of your sentiment in the way that you asked it, is you imply that it's kind of us and them and all the rest of it. It is just about us, and we've got to have, I think, a different narrative. And we've got to do it fast, because we have, as I said, until January 2016.
Thank you. Ruth, how do you narrow that political gap?
So I'm going to try and talk to Kit and Bernadette's questions at the same time, I think, which is a conversation about where is power and how do you change where power is within businesses and institutions. It's really difficult. First, you've got to acknowledge that you have it, which is a theme that I've been obviously playing out with you guys during the course of the day. You can't change where power lies until you understand that you've actually located it within your own institutions. And so I think quite a lot of the time, part of the challenge is just to say to people in large businesses, you are now the most powerful political entity in the world. What do you think about that? How do you feel about that? How are you going to exercise that power? Where do you think the moral hazard is involved in that? Because it's not okay to say, we're just a business. You're clearly not just a business. Money and power has migrated into the hands of a very small number of people who own businesses and run businesses and have not been democratically elected. So that's life, right? I don't necessarily think that the outcome of that is a disaster, because I actually think that those businesses have the potential agency, once they acknowledge they have the power, massively to democratize the way in which they're run. So I also think that this applies to civil society. This is a huge challenge for us. I mean, you could argue that Greenpeace is the kind of global corporate, kind of NGO. It's a real challenge for us to think about how we start actually crowdsourcing the issues we work on, the solutions we drive from our supporters, extending our supporter base, working in communities, just giving away all that centralized power so that something else happens. Once you start doing it, it's really, really exciting. But it kind of does require an acknowledgement of power, a willingness to accept that you need to diversify where that power comes from, and then a change in things of governance structures. So what, for example, will be the response of many of the large companies to a proposition that there should be worker representation on boards in companies like there is in Germany? That's a way of changing the power structure within companies, but I suspect they'll probably feel very uncomfortable about that because it's not the model you're used to working with. I take Kit's point, but actually I passionately want the same kinds of changes in the political economy that you're talking about. I just see the division here between power concentrated in the hands of a very small number of individuals who actually kind of exist in a kind of transboundary global elite, and pretty much everybody else on the receiving end of that. So I don't necessarily see it as a north-south divide, but there is an institutional challenge. And I go back to Paul Polman's point, where he stood in front of a group of businesses that he convened, and he said, you no longer have a license to operate, because when you're not paying tax in the countries that you live in, when people can see that the money is being concentrated in the hands of a tiny number of individuals, and you do not take responsibility for your impact in the world, sooner or later you're going to reap the whirlwind of that. And I think when you're thinking about risk as a business, you kind of need to think about the risks inherent in a political economy which is as unequal as the one that we currently face, because sooner or later the consequences of that will be felt by those who have power, don't acknowledge that they have it, and continue to hold on to it.
Christof, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, specifically on this point, I very much agree with Rowan's point on the power of consumers, as little as it might appear, but I think ultimately that's what drives behavior in a market model. And on Ruth's points, I largely agree, maybe with a small difference, that I think if we remind ourselves that businesses are mainly there to make money, that's why the people who have money give them more of their money, and it's probably a steep order to expect that those businesses who are entrusted with dealing with that money then also, at the same time, worry about the more equitable distribution of that money, or, in fact, the power of dealing with it.
Is that unreasonable?
I don't know. I think...
Paul Polman doesn't think so.
No, well, exactly. And I think there are certain enabling factors. And one is, I think, what I said earlier. I think there's a very, very large difference between an organization, a business in this case, as an entity which behaves as an entity, as a complex organism in a certain way, vis-a-vis the individuals in that company or in that organization who drive certain aspects of that behavior, but not all of them. And I think the other question is on the framework in which they operate. And I think that's very much set by consumer behavior, that's very much set by political guidance, and how much we allow certain things to happen or not to happen from political perspectives. That's not to say there's no responsibility in business. I think there's huge responsibility in business. But I think we've got to be realistic in our expectations, what we think businesses can do and will do, and how much we entrust them, actually, to drive the important strategies and policies that we want to see. Is it realistic to see them done by businesses?
Okay, let's not have an argument about businesses. Let's now bring some more questions in. Gerry, I'll let you off there. You can come in a bit later. Right, I'm going to bring in some from online. Just put your hands up so the microphones can go. The man in the yellow tie, Pramod sitting there, and the gentleman sitting here in the check shirt. Yes, sorry. No, first of all, online, and then there was the man in the yellow tie. Well, you can give the mic, and then there was a chap in the check shirt, and Pramod sitting just there, who I'd like to hear from as well. So let's hear the online questions.
Okay, I'll ask a couple. First from Paul in Japan. In the context of trade, how do we deal with the problem of food speculation in the global markets? That he means the Wall Street factor. A question referring to something Christine Allen mentioned briefly on customary land rights. How do we deal with land grabbing and large-scale land acquisition related to climate change and impacts on food security? And then 2 questions related for Rowan, one from Manu in India. How do you actually ensure fair practices in financial mechanisms or risk incorporation in the existing system, the one that you say is a game changer? And what's the plan for achieving full financial inclusion by 2016?
Okay, before you answer, I just want to take a couple more from the audience, and then we can, we've got quite a few questions to get through. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, just a very quick one. Peter Baker from Cabby. I fully agree with the comments on risk and really how risk is increasing for farmers. I just wondered if we could turn it back to the IPCC report and ask you whether you're happy about the way risk was managed in the report. Was it dealt with properly? Was it in the sort of language that business people or ordinary people can understand and learn from?
Okay, and Pramod, you had a question, and perhaps you'd like to answer that. How do you think risk was managed in the report?
No, I'm here to provoke the panel further. Well, I'm a big supporter of private investment in agriculture in order to manage risk. But if you look at historically, in the context of climate change and climate risk management, huge public money has been invested through public sector in risk management in different countries, especially in the context of agriculture, especially in countries like ours. But if you look at last 30 years, all this private sector has made big money. They've become more and more viable and profitable. But crop yields and farmers, the risk exposure, the risk adaptation has remained just the same. So perhaps the risk exposure, as I said, is still the same, and farmers have not really progressed. So is this really a viable solution for future?
Right. Gerry, would you like to answer one of those questions? Several there: risk adaptation, land rights, or trade.
I think just picking up on land rights, I think there's a couple of different angles to improving protection of land rights. One is around substantially improved transparency and accountability of governments and private enterprises around all land transactions. But I think the other side of the coin also is significantly improved land titling processes within developing countries themselves. And I think to some extent they're two sides of the same coin, but I think you definitely need to tackle both. So there's improved clarity of ownership. That should not be used as an excuse for taking away customary rights by simply imposing modern land rights and sort of attributing those to the powerful. So it needs to be done in a much more sensitive way towards customary land rights. But you know, that's the general principles I would follow.
Thank you. Ruth.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point about transparency, and I guess also partly the kind of moral hazard point that I've already made, but an interesting question, I think, about how we can raise the consciousness of consumers and people involved in the food system about the origin of that food in a context of both land grabs and food speculation, because I think there's a real lack of awareness. I mean, if you think over 20 years, the extent to which actually consumers have become incredibly sensitized to the impacts of what we eat and use in this country on rainforests, for example, so that it's a very bold company that decides that it's going to take on the kind of, sort of a global campaign for rainforest protection. I don't see an equivalent understanding amongst the kind of aware consumers of the risks associated with large-scale land grab, with the impact on smallholders, and understanding about land rights. And I think there's something that we can kind of collectively do together to build that understanding, then to kind of exercise that consumer power backwards. I mean, one other point, I guess, is that there is some learning that's already been done around this in a context where the RED mechanism inside the UN, which was obviously designed to try to inject large quantities of cash towards rainforest protection, but happened sometimes in the context of a carbon market that was really extraordinarily insensitive to land ownership issues and to subsistence livelihoods on the ground. That system has actually kind of evolved, not to be perfect, but at least to recognize that the sort of ground zero for being able to undertake those sorts of rainforest protection projects is all about disentangling land tenure. So perhaps there's learning that we can take out of that system and expand elsewhere.
There was a question about trade, one of the online questions. Christof, do you have any opinions on that?
Could you repeat the question?
The trade. Vanessa, do you want to repeat the question about trade?
Yes. In the context of trade, how do we deal with the problem of food speculation on the global markets?
Yeah, okay. I don't know how well food speculation is really essentially understood, and I think there was a lot of work done on it in 2008-9 in the wake of the price hike. And I think we understand too little, and there are certain commodities where individuals, almost individual speculators, can actually swing. I mean, we know all the cocoa example, where individuals can actually make an impact because they're able to amass so much capital behind this. There's also a role of the individual farmer. So individual farmers unconsciously act as speculators because they can, for example, decide when they sell, and they sell when the price is high. So if I can store my maize for another 2 months because I think it's going to be higher later on. So there's a huge dynamic there, and I don't think that we essentially really understand, and Rowan may be a better place to answer this question, how this all works globally and how much it really has an impact on long-term pricing. Maybe a quick comment on the land grabbing that was made as well. I think there is a fundamental dilemma that a lot of governments in poor countries face because they have very little options for rural development. And if a foreign investor comes along and offers a large foreign investment, they may not be in the luxury position to actually decide whether it's a good offer or a bad offer. It may be the only offer they have. And that only offer they have may look a lot more attractive than no offer at all. So if somebody comes along and says, I'm going to build roads and ports and a railway, that may be, they may know that's overall the package is actually a disadvantage for the country, but in the short term this may be a better option. And so I think there's a huge question around actually how do we increase the instruments that, so maybe the game changers, that national governments in poor countries have available to take these offers as one out of a range rather than the only game in town.
Okay. Any more questions? Gentleman in the yellow tie, yes.
Thank you. John Morton, University of Greenwich. I'd like to suggest that the corporate sector, when it interfaces with smallholder farmers and the rural poor, and particularly when it does so under the banner of corporate social responsibility, can be very good at teaching and training and educating, giving farmers information, giving them incentives to bring their product up to various standards, business standards or sustainability standards or quality standards. I'd like to suggest it's much less good at learning from farmers, that there's a real pattern that the corporate sector can fail to appreciate the different logics of risk management that farmers practice, for failing to appreciate that pastoralists regard livestock as savings and insurance as well as output, or failing to include as central the different risks to which smallholders are subject, bracketing those off as unforeseens and not including them in the core of the business plan. I don't know what the panel's reaction to those suggestions would be.
Okay, and just one more question. Yes, at the front here. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you. Jim Stevenson from PwC. We've spoken a lot about global business and the private sector at a global level. We've also spoken a lot at the farm level about smallholders. But what I think we haven't talked about, and this comes to a point I think the panel made earlier, that at a global level, retailer and consumer companies don't have visibility down to the farmer level. The reason is because there's a whole chain of traders, consolidators, exporters, importers. And when we work with our retail and consumer clients, and we help them assess climate risk in their agricultural supply chains, they're unable to really target where that risk lies and how to act on it. So I was interested for the panel's view on what do they do about that? Is it a sort of a stick mechanism where they, down the supply chain, they ask that certain standards and practices are adhered to? Or is it a carrot mechanism? Is it all about incentives? How do they make it more commercially attractive for their suppliers further down the value chain to be looking at climate risk and dealing with it head on?
Thank you. Well, two questions there. Carrot and stick, and also the corporate sector. How do they learn from the farmers on the ground? Who would like to answer that first?
Sorry, can I talk a little bit about the question of visibility? Because it seems to me that over the last 30 plus years, multinationals moved their business models away from being direct manufacturers and sometimes growers. So, for instance, Unilever traditionally had quite substantial plantations and have a few left, I think, to a model where everything is outsourced and subcontracted, and until very recently, retailers and multinational processors didn't really care very much where the stuff was coming from, as long as it met standards of quality and price and availability. So I think that the real question isn't, certainly I wouldn't encourage the people at the head of the supply chain to take big sticks to their suppliers. What I would encourage, clearly, is that the retailers and the major multinational brands take on themselves clear responsibility and transparency, and therefore accountability, to discovering what the sources of their crops are, how they're processed, how they're traded, and how they actually move through the supply chain, and under what conditions. And those ideas, they're quite feasible. We see some level of that transparency in things like fair trade, and there are businesses at the moment who do make some effort towards establishing their ultimate sources of supply, and sometimes do so to manage their own risks. So, for instance, one supermarket chain I did a little bit of work with was very interested in who its smallholders were, because that actually had quite an impact on residue levels of pesticides, etc., which were a major threat to its supply in terms of the supplies being accepted within the EU. So there are actually some business cases for finding out who your ultimate sources of supply are. But really, at the end of the day, multinationals, whether retailers or food manufacturers, have to take back on board the responsibility which they have for their entire supply chain. They try to divest it, and whilst that improved their return on capital, ethically it was inappropriate. And it's about time they step back up to the plate.
I just wanted to ask David, how are we doing for time? Is it time now to do the questions, or have we got time to take more?
I think you've got time for more questions.
Okay. Would anyone like to comment on what Gerry has just said? Christof?
Yeah, so I very much agree with that point, the answers to I think, the risk question there. I think there's carrots and sticks that need to be balanced in the system. And maybe a quick comment on the question from there about how smallholders actually manage risk and how that's perceived or not perceived. And I think that is certainly very, very true that a lot of companies don't appreciate that initially. I would hold that also a lot of development organizations don't appreciate that, and about only 5 to 10% of all smallholders globally are actually part of a bigger, maybe international supply chain. So the vast majority of them actually don't trade into these kind of bigger company contexts. So it sort of holds true, I think, in general. I think that has a very important implication, which is that farmers very fundamentally behave very different from what others would like them to behave. If I'm using farming as one of my many livelihood strategies, I put probably a lot less effort into it than if I were a professional farmer and only that, or maybe had another income source. That is potentially a conflict with seeing smallholder farmers as agents of food security, because they could farm much better and they could make much bigger contributions to food security. And it's the same for a company that would like to source from smallholders, because they're interested in consistency of the quality. They're interested in getting certain volumes. They're not interested in many small farmers producing small volumes. They want big, consistent volumes. They're interested in the efficiencies in the system. And I think not really understanding how poor people manage risk and livelihood strategies, and that farming is a component in that, very often a small component actually, I think is a very fundamental challenge, and one that neither companies nor development organizations, I think, appreciate.
Thank you, Christof. Rowan, just a quick comment, then I'm going to bring a couple more questions in.
Yeah, I'm very quickly going to try and answer a lot of questions which were sort of melded together. So first of all, a grim observation. We're all human beings, and we need to believe in something. And we believe there's some uber force of key power people up at the top who just need to be changed in their mindset. I'll give you some really grim news. Most CEOs don't have as much power as you think. They're only there for 3 or 4 years, and they're driven by all sorts of factors. So they don't actually have all the power you think. And you think, yeah, because they're driven by what the market thinks. So then you think, oh, well, it's the institutional investors who really matter. It's the big pension fund managers. Well, they're all driven by their performance metrics, and they come and go every two. So then you think, oh, well, it's the uber owners of capital, the big cheeses somewhere who kind of own it. And actually, most of them are paranoid about winning or losing 100 billion. And actually, do you know what? Most of them don't necessarily know or care. Some do. So, and then there's the media folks. So there isn't some uber group up there who are all kind of have to be. There is no kind of uber force. That's the first thing. The second observation is to the lady who came from Spain. And one of the questions on the panel, how do we make this risk fair? I cannot overemphasize the critical role of science. It's our hearth. We all go there. It's all we have. The integrity of science is critical. To the gentleman who said, does the IPCC report represent risks? Well, not bad, but the critical thing is the modeling gearbox, the transmission systems between science, capital, and policy. Lots to do there. One final observation, if I may, Madam Chairman, is for those of you lucky enough to be in London today, not on the online, if you want actually an object lesson in how we have to think, take a 10-minute walk to the Guildhall. The Guildhall, you're in a very interesting legislative part of Britain. The City of London actually, its sort of non-written constitution predates the Magna Carta. It has its own system of government. The Tower of London was built for 2 reasons. One, to protect London outside of the city, but also to tell the City of London who was ultimately in charge. But actually, if you wanted political freedom, you got inside the walls of the City of London, and you had freedom over the rest of the state. And do you know why? Because to enable business to operate, it needed to enable civic and political rights, which could not be given elsewhere. And if you go to the Guildhall, and please go there, it is the most incredible building, you will see rules of measurement, rules of science, which were fundamental to then organizing markets and organizing policy. And that institution has existed and governs much of what we do in its own way for nearly 1,000 years. It's an object lesson on where we need to go. So my final point is, markets are like fire. They're an incredible servant, but not always the ultimate master. But in the end, only fire keeps you warm and cooks your food.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we are running out of time. So those 2 of you who are poised with your microphones, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to ask you them. I am going to ask you all one final question, which is a part of our poll, and it'll just be interesting to see your opinion. Let's go back now to the smallholder farmers, which we seem to have forgotten about. Should countries prioritize helping smallholder farmers over large-scale farmers? Put your hands up. Yes, if we should prioritize smallholders, raise your hands. And if we should prioritize the large-scale farmers, well, that was an overwhelming yes in favor of small-scale farmers. And online, I wonder what they've got to say, Vanessa.
Equal option.
I think we need a few more minutes, so come back to me.
Well,
the results are coming in as I see them.
They're still coming. I'm not surprised about that at all. I think we might have to forget the poor online folks, but I know what you're going to say. So thank you very much for voting. Come on, Vanessa. Do we have a vote now?
Okay. Can I get the results?
We'll have the news at the end.
Okay, why not?
Leave us in suspense.
Yes, right. David, do you want to?
Yeah. Okay, thank you to Anya and to all the panel members. So maybe I'll excuse you from the front row, and I notice everybody's been swinging around, but thank you very much. Again, I think it was a very interesting and informative discussion, and great questions and comments from the online audiences as well. I'd now like to invite Camilla Toulmin. Camilla is the Director of International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. She's an economist by training, done a lot of work in Africa, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel on pastoralism. She's helped change people's lives by making an impact, by improving policies to give action on the ground. So Camilla, if you can try and capture some of the key points that you've heard in the next sort of few minutes, then that'd be great, and then we'll move to the closing of the meeting. Thanks, Camilla.
Great. Well, thanks very much, David, and good afternoon. IIED, as you probably know, works particularly on issues of adaptation as they relate to climate change in the least developed countries. So it's been really interesting and very sobering to read through only the summary of the Working Group 2. I shall try and dig into the longer report shortly. Thank you also to Willis, CCAFs and other organisations for asking me to sum up this valuable event to highlight the findings of Working Group 2 report and implications for food and agriculture. Our moderator, David Howlett, asked me to say, so what's different? What are the game changers following this latest IPCC report? And I'll try and do that. And I'll also try and flag a couple of issues that have come up during the discussions this morning, all in less than 15 minutes, so that we leave enough time for Lynne Featherstone, Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for International Development, who's going to close the meeting. So I may speak fast, but we can hopefully chat up subsequently over lunch. First, on the science, what's changed? Well, even clearer, even more unequivocal evidence of climate change impacts on agricultural and food systems today, not tomorrow, today, and on marine ecosystems where some of the hardest evidence can be found, and that these impacts will rise with increased greenhouse gas emissions. We can also see that the negative impacts on crop yields far outweigh the limited benefits from CO2 fertilization that you find in some temperate regions. But these impacts can be limited if we take action now. But the evidence shows the longer we delay, the harsher the impacts and the greater the risks. We've heard that it's critical to understand the great variability in rainfall and temperature conditions between contexts and over time, and the higher risks of extreme events. Average figures, I think, can often hide, as Rowan said, the huge importance of risk and the range of possible events and impacts. It's often the impact of extreme events acting in combination that can be most devastating. I think the science also points to where uncertainty lies in current knowledge and future projections. We don't know all we need to know, but we are increasingly sure of a small but significant risk of catastrophic impacts, what's called the fat tail problem, for those of you who study distribution issues. Second, we now recognize the systemic nature of climate change and its impacts. I'd like to think that quite a lot of us had realized that a long time ago, but I think it really is much clearer, more evident. There's been a false distinction made between addressing climate change on the one hand and dealing with poverty and economic growth on the other. And I think, as a number of people have said, that distinction is false and pushes us in the wrong direction. We can see from Working Group 2 report and discussion here that continued climate change impacts will push the battle against poverty in the wrong direction. Healthy ecosystems are vital to healthy economies, particularly for the poorer half of the population. Climate change multiplies the risks and vulnerability faced by farmers and by urban dwellers, especially in poor countries. So, accepting the systemic nature of climate change also means we must look for a systemic response. And that means all of us who want to address the challenges of climate change, to curb climate change, to cut greenhouse gas emissions, means we have to put on one side our own particular specialness and join forces with each other, build a common language, build a common movement that allows us to make serious progress in terms of the practice, but also in terms of the politics. Third, I think we have to recognize the importance of the finance sector, which has been a really interesting key element in the discussion this morning. Here we are in the City of London, home of global capital, investment, insurance, business, banking. You can see all of these, call them grey elephants or ivory towers or whatever they are, in the City of London. We've had increasing recognition of the barriers which the current finance and accounting sectors place on the move to greater sustainability, and significant progress in trying to move some of those barriers. But we must continue to address the perverse incentives and short-termism that you find in so much of our finance and business community, and which were major contributors to the worst crash that we've had for several generations. Clearly, luckily, there are some businesses that recognize the risks climate change poses for their profitability. We've heard, everybody's heard of Paul Toulmin and the wonderful work that Unilever does. Luckily, there are some other food and soft drinks companies who are following the same kind of approach, Sainsbury, Nestle, and others. Equally, insurance companies, Willis, Lloyd's, a whole number of insurance companies, recognize that their business faces an existential threat from climate change. And that's a very good place to start if you want to try and achieve a major shift in policy mindset and metrics. But I have to say, there are also big companies which remain big blocks to making progress and who use the current political structures and lobbying to sow uncertainty, hesitancy, skepticism in a very unhelpful way. And that's been particularly evident in the run-up to some of the discussions about energy and climate change in the European Parliament. But we need a strong European Union position on climate change if we're going to get anywhere with the COP21 at the end of next year, which will be preceded by the UN Secretary-General's meeting in September of this year. As Ruth from Greenpeace reminded us, markets in the private sector have been lauded as providing many of the answers to the problems we face. We need them to be making a louder noise, pushing our governments to be more ambitious, matching the power they have with the responsibility that goes with that. One more important game changer for me is the new emphasis on urban food systems, on urban vulnerability, especially of people living in informal settlements, and on urban consumption. If you look at the Working Group 2 report, there is this time a much more balanced treatment of the risks faced by the more than 50% of the global population now living in cities. There's a big agenda to work on to build more resilient cities in terms both of the hardware, that's to say the built environment, and the software, the governance, the institutions, the markets, which together can help reduce risks to both city dwellers and people living in the wider hinterland. I think this water-food nexus is particularly tight and difficult in the Middle East and North African region, where more than 50% of food needs are sourced from outside the region, a region likely to be further stressed by drought and temperature increases, and where appalling conflict, not only in Syria, but in the wider region, creates greater impoverishment and vulnerability. And if you want a frightening read, then read that bit of Working Group 2 report. On urban consumption, I think also we're starting to see big shifts in the debate about the need to look at consumption patterns, the need to address overconsumption, malconsumption, and waste, since these are drivers not only of poor human health, but also of poor planetary health. And it was interesting to see today that the French Senate is proposing a fast food tax, somewhat similar to what the UK Action on Sugar is proposing on sugar, that we need to address patterns of consumption that create significant public health costs. Finally, I think we need to think forward to events this year and the next if we are to get a more ambitious deal in Paris next year. A key point in that is the Ban Ki-moon summit in September this year. We need strong, powerful voices from business, from governments, from cities, from civil society being heard at that meeting. In particular, for us, we need many of the poor countries most impacted by current climate impacts having their voices heard. We learned from Copenhagen in 2009 that we need to start early to build the political will and commitment to get global agreements on curbing greenhouse gases. So the launch of the Working Group 2 report this week is an important building block, as will be Working Group 3 reporting in 10 days' time. But we know knowledge is only one element in achieving change. Interests often trump evidence, and that's why I found it particularly illuminating to get the sort of give and take and debate around the importance of power and political economy that we've had here today. So that's my attempt to sum up. Lynne, let me hand over to you to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilla, for a very succinct summary. It now gives me sort of great pleasure to invite one of my ministers in DFID, Lynne Featherstone. She's the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for International Development. In her portfolio is also climate change. She's also MP for Hornsey and Wood Green. So, Minister, please.
Thank you. Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for coming to this meeting on the implications of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report on climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability for agriculture, jobs and food security. It's a very long title, but a very important one. I'm very pleased to see a wide range of stakeholders here today, especially from civil society and the private sector. Quite frankly, your engagement is absolutely crucial in helping to tackle the issue of climate change. And a little bird told me on the way in that you were questioning the political will. You need not question my political will. It is there full force. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be here for the whole meeting, and I'm very grateful to Camilla. Where's she gone? Oh, there. Very grateful to Camilla Toulmin for her clear summary It sounds like it was a very productive morning, but there is really a great deal of work to do as we move towards the future. For me, the IPCC report has some messages for how we manage climate change. Unmitigated climate change poses great risk to human health, to global food security, economic development, and the effects are already widespread. And it is essential to remember that mitigation is the only real long-term solution to reducing emissions and avoiding dangerous climate change. And it mustn't be overlooked. And that is why the UK government is working towards an ambitious deal in Paris in 2015. So the IPCC report has a number of important messages. Firstly, I would say that climate change is an extra burden for those living in poverty. Floods and droughts continue to cause suffering, and these affect livelihoods by reducing crop yields as well as destroying homes, as we saw in the Philippines. Climate change can slow economic growth, making it harder to reduce the number of people living in poverty, and it can also create new poverty traps, particularly in urban areas. We can already see the impact that climate change is having. Rainfall patterns are changing, glaciers are shrinking, permafrost is thawing. I know you know all this, but I'm going to tell you again anyway. Droughts in the last decade in Russia and Australia and other regions have contributed to higher food prices. Closer to home, this winter, we've seen in the UK how flooding affects farms and homes and devastates people's lives. And the IPCC predicts that the impact of heat waves and droughts and floods and cyclones and wildfires all likely to increase. And the report also predicts that climate change without adaptation will reduce yields for the world's major crops, wheat, rice, and maize. Some projections predict yield losses of 25% by 2050. This is going to cause some serious challenges as demand is expected to rise. And as a result, the gap between supply and demand is simply going to widen. Farmers and pastoralists in semi-arid regions will be particularly vulnerable to shortages of water for crops and for livestock. Fish catches in the tropics are also predicted to go down, impacting on incomes and on diet. So clearly something needs to be done urgently to avert a crisis. Achieving a deal in Paris is the first step towards a solution. We, the government, are working for an outcome which reduces emissions and keeps increases in global average temperatures to under 2%. The report states warming over 4% centigrade will cause severe, pervasive, and irreversible change. We must avoid this at all costs, and we actually must do what we say. I hear myself saying we must avoid this at all costs. We really must do that, and that includes the government. The IPCC is clear on the importance of helping people adapt to climate change. It shows how governments are already developing plans and policies to integrate climate change into broader and longer term development. The UK is doing this at home, is helping developing countries build resilience to climate change overseas. The UK is spending up to 50% of our International Climate Fund on helping poor communities adapt and become resilient. Through the fund, we are focusing our efforts on key areas, including agriculture, food, and water security. So let me give you some examples of what we're doing. First, we're supporting the International Fund for Agriculture Development's Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Programme, ASAP. Michael Modicini, IFAD's vice president, is with us. I promoted you there momentarily. Vice president is with us today. And I'm really pleased to see the significant progress that ASAP has made since our Deputy Prime Minister announced the UK support of up to £150 million during the Rio +20 conference in 2012. I was also very glad to see ASAP win an award last November, announced by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for its innovative work to deliver social and economic benefits to smallholder farmers. Really well done. I have a particular interest in smallholder farmers. Not a personal interest, I hasten to add, but in my portfolio, a particular interest. ASAP now has 12 projects under implementation. In Mali, ASAP is helping to reduce pressure on scarce natural resources, generate labour and time-saving opportunities for women, and is helping build resilience to climate change by increasing access to improved and drought-tolerant crops. It's also introducing innovative biogas energy sources. Using this clean energy source reduces exposure to indoor air pollution, something that's killing over 2.5 million people annually, the majority of whom are women and children. Natural disasters brought on by climate change can have enormous costs. The floods in Pakistan in 2010 affected more than 20 million people and caused damages of over $10 billion US. Women are especially vulnerable in these disasters. For example, in Burma during the cyclone Nargis in 2008, over 61% of those killed were women. That's why we're helping build resilience, especially of women, to these disasters. One of the ways we're doing this is through BRACED, the BRACED program, that stands for Building Resilience and Adaptation to Climate Extremes and Disasters. And through BRACED, we're providing 21 grants to 21 projects led by NGOs to scale up activities in South Asia and Africa with a focus on improving agricultural practices. One project led by Oxfam is helping 1.5 million people living in the coastal and dry zones of Burma to become better at coping with floods and droughts and cyclones. In Ethiopia, a project led by Farm Africa is working with the private sector to help build the resilience of over 300,000 people. And this will include better access to financial services, including insurance schemes, and the promotion of new avenues for saving and for credit. The private sector also has a very important role to play in building resilience. And at Davos this year, the global business community identified water supply for agriculture and industrial processes as one of their top 4 risks. We are helping build partnerships between the public and the private sectors through our support to International Water Stewardship Programme, a joint initiative with the German development agency, GIZ, which addresses these risks. An example would be in South Africa, the Mfuleni municipality and Sasol, a major chemical and energy company, identified that access to water was a problem for both households and for Sasol. The municipality and Sasol developed a joint initiative to improve infrastructure and water efficiency. And this partnership, brokered by International Water Stewardship Programme, resulted in increased access to a safe and more reliable water supply for 330,000 households, while helping Sasol reduce its water consumption by 15% but maintain productivity. So that was a win-win. We like win-wins. We also support one of today's hosts, the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Research Programme, which has projects in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Asia. In Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, it has a project assessing the needs of farmers for climate information and its dissemination through mobile phones. It is also, importantly, through meetings like today, helping communicate research evidence to policymakers. And things like that mobile phone information technology is just transformative in terms of the ability it gives farmers to know what's coming, to know what the prices are, to know how not to get gypped at market, all of those things. Innovations and technologies really are important. We supported the World Agroforestry Centre and its African partners on the use of fertilizer trees and shrubs. Results have been impressive. In Malawi, farms planted with these trees can produce up to 2 tons more maize per hectare, while helping farmers to adapt to changing climate by making their crops more resilient to drought. We're also utilising British expertise by working with the UK Met Office, Hadley Centre, to help African forecasters improve the prediction of droughts and heavy rains. Later this year, we're going to launch a major new project called Future Climate for Africa with the Natural Environment Research Council. That project's going to work in sub-Saharan Africa to improve climate prediction models. for warning of droughts and floods saves lives, and the improved information produced by this program is expected to help literally millions of people in Africa. So in sum, we are working extensively with the public and private sector to tackle the impacts of climate change. The IPCC report demonstrates that there really is a very, very long way still to go. The private sector and civil society have a key role to play in scaling up the international response. You've heard today about the effects of climate change for developing countries, but also you've heard how much can actually be done to adapt to these. And Camilla, in her summary, set out a number of actions. I look forward to hearing about how you get on. So whether you are an academic, a researcher, a member of civil society, a policymaker, or from the private sector, you all have a job to do. I accept I, as a politician, also have a job to do. The IPCC report has underlined the importance of taking more action, and now is the time to act. I would argue that before was the time to act, but we are where we are. Before I conclude, I would like to thank Willis Ray and Rowan Douglas, Chairman of the Willis Research Network, for hosting this meeting, and to the organizations who helped to make this happen. The Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Research Program, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, the World Bank, and Prince Charles International Sustainability Unit. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Minister. And also thank you to the audience here and also to the online audience. We had probably several hundred people out there as well, and we had a very active participation online. Again, I just want to give my personal thanks to all the organisers, and again, particularly to Willis Reeve for giving this lovely facility. It now just gives me one thing to do, is really to invite you to lunch, which I think will be where we had coffee, and hopefully you can do some more networking there. So thank you for coming, and look forward to talking to you upstairs. Thank you.